If you think about it, in the past, before the camera, people could live their whole lives without seeing a single image except the iconography in their church.
Yeah.
There's reasons that people, went on pilgrimages and traveled for months to fall on their knees in front of a Michelangelo painting and would weep and would just be completely moved by the experience because they literally never saw imagery. Let's compare that today when we are you see 100 images before breakfast, and they're mostly images trying to sell you something.
So my name is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching me or listening on a podcast on many different sites, Facebook being one, YouTube, all sorts of podcast delivery systems. And today is a wonderful opportunity for me because we are interviewing and talking to Sadie Valeri, who I have known, even though this sounds cliched, since she was a child, because she is the same age as my daughter, Jessica, and they went to high school together. And so, to put it mildly, I have been tracking her career. But even if I did not know Sadie, and not because I know her, I can safely tell you this, and that is Sadie Valeri is the best American painter living right now in the United States. I did not say she's the best artist. I think she is a great artist, but that's a value judgment I would not make. But arguably, once you look at her work, if painting is a skill and a craft, and art is a different form of expression that includes things that aren't skills and crafts, including filmmaking and music and abstraction and other things. Sadie's both an artist and a craftswoman, but she also happens to be able to paint in a way that most contemporary people who look at art don't think is possible anymore. And there's a whole story there that I'm going to get her to tell. We will look at some of Sadie's work. But first, Sadie, I'd like you to just give me a thumbnail sketch of your story, and I will point out a couple things before you start, that you went to the Rhode Island School of Design after you were at the Waring School in Massachusetts, where my daughter and you went. And you hit it in what year? When did you start at RISD?
I started at RISD in 1989. I was there from 89 to 93. Yeah.
And in a way, you had the misfortune of hitting the school as someone who loved to paint at a very moment when a great deal of the art community had decided that painting itself was irrelevant, and especially if you were painting in any realistic or traditional form. And I know that's a simplification, but that's about right, isn't it?
Yeah, at least in my experience, there are different art bubbles that you could be part of or not part of, but figurative art was, I could not name any living figurative artist when I was at RISD. I probably could name Lucian Freud. I think he was the only one I knew of. And it wasn't so much that RISD was anti-painting, but just, I don't hold RISD itself responsible, but the early 90s was essentially, from the 60s through the 90s was really a period when you were supposed to maybe do some figure drawing sort of as 1 year as an undergraduate, and then you were supposed to move on and be a unique artist by the time you were 19.
Yeah, and so that's the era that people like Damien Hirst started coming out of. I always get my dates wrong on everything, but of course, broad strokes, we have abstract expressionism in America. Painting goes that way. And then, of course, there's Freud and a few others. But the skill of painting itself was very much under assault, wasn't it? When you talk about figurative art.
It was, and I was lucky to take a couple really good classes at RISD where we did museum copying. RISD has a really beautiful small museum with some great works in there. So I was able to take a museum copying course that taught me a lot about traditional painting. And I took a really great human anatomy class over at Brown University, because RISD is right next to Brown. So we were lucky to have some cross-pollination there. But essentially, I went to art school to learn how to draw like Michelangelo. And I remember about halfway through saying, is it junior year they teach us to draw like Michelangelo? Yeah. Maybe it's senior year. And graduating and being like, they never did that.
Yeah.
So
I remember a talk confusing. That you gave a little while ago where you said something interesting. You were saying that you had just sort of assumed that, well, maybe we just don't do that anymore. Somehow we forgot how to do it. And that this just doesn't happen anymore.
I thought maybe it was sort of a DNA thing, like human beings just physically were not capable of drawing and painting the way I saw the old masters draw and paint. Because as far as I could tell, the old masters drew and painted realistically without cameras better than we do with cameras.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, maybe it's just a talent that they had. And an American concept of talent is that you're born with it or you're not. So it wasn't a very big leap to assume that people today aren't born with it.
Yeah.
And I had always been told that I draw very well, and I had always been, identified as a painter and was really encouraged as a painter and an artist. And so I was like, well, if anybody was going to learn how to do it, I would have learned how to do it. And I didn't see any of my peers or myself or my teachers painting or drawing like any of the old masters that I had studied in high school.
Yeah. One thing I find very interesting about your work is that I know these terms are sort of crazy, but I find your work intensely modern in the true sense of the word, in that there are elements to it that are completely original and I have not seen before in terms of the choice of your subject matter and the way you group things. In no sense are you a copyist, not that there's anything wrong with that, but for people who are aware of things like Dutch 17th century still lifes and so forth, your paintings don't look like that, but and going out on a limb here, you bring the same level of technical skill and chops to the work as I think the Dutch 17th century painters did, which is kind of crazy in the North American context. It would be nuts in Europe, but here it just seems unfathomable that you have done the work to achieve this. So I'm going to look at a picture of yours in a minute. What's the proper title of Silver Goblet?
Wrapped Silver Goblet.
Wrapped Silver Goblet. And
yeah.
the painting that you've made is of a silver goblet, but wrapped in?
It's in wax paper. So
yes.
I use, kitchen wax paper, and I sculpt it and crumple it and arrange it in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah, and I find that stunning because you're using something that is not considered, would not be considered normally as an object in talking about the Dutch 17th century, those painters and so forth. And yet they were contemporary to their moment as well. So that, they were not just painting Roman and Greek artifacts. So that, what's interesting to me is why you have gone back into a classical mode in some sense and learning, beginning all the way with the Romans to our own era, which I've seen you do in a lecture. The subject matter you choose, while portrayed in a very realistic manner, but even realistic is a little wrong, as people will see in a moment, but in this incredibly precise manner. Nevertheless, you are not pretending you're living in another century, because wax paper is a contemporary, modern
that's an interesting thing that people talk about a lot is, are you imitating the past? And what is fascinating is even, forgers from the 1950s who fooled people by making Vermeers in the 1950s. Today, they look like 1950s painters.
Right. Even
when we try and actually copy and forge, we end up making portraits of ourselves anyway. So I'm not actually too worried about being accused of being a copyist. I do copy a lot of master copies to learn the techniques. And essentially what it looks like to me is a lot of painters are influenced by photography, and not just photography, but by advertising.
Yes.
And when you think about it, we are bombarded with images all day, every day. If you think about it, in the past, before the camera, people could live their whole lives without seeing a single image except the iconography in their church. There's reasons that people, went on pilgrimages and traveled for months to fall on their knees in front of a Michelangelo painting. And would weep and would just be completely moved by the experience because they literally never saw imagery. Let's compare that today when we are you see 100 images before breakfast, and they're mostly images trying to sell you something. Yeah. And so when people say my work looks like the old masters, it's because I spend my days really trying to look at paintings more than I look at photographs. I'm filling my mind with those images as sort of to defend myself against the assault of just constant imagery.
One thing I find very moving about your work, and then we're about to go to the picture here. So Ernie, prepare yourself to give a silver goblet in a few moments. But I find a tremendous sort of inner stillness in it, which is the opposite of the fast cuts and the bombardment of commercial imagery we're now used to. Your paintings are all like one frame of a truly great story that you could live with for the rest of your life if that was the only image you had. You would not get tired of it. Maybe we can put up Silver Goblet and take a look. Okay, so if you are looking at this now, this is a silver goblet wrapped in wax paper. And this painting's dimension would be what? How big?
This is about 11 by 14, maybe.
So it's quite
11.
small.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's about life size. So that's a goblet a large goblet that you could pick up and drink out of. So it's about life size.
Now, it seems to me that I'm seeing a little bit of a reflection of something in what is the top right-hand corner, but the left, camera left, as it were.
Actually, in the photograph, it doesn't show up, but when you see the painting in person, there's actually a tiny reflection of me in the center. Yeah. But in the photograph, it's hard to see.
It's hard to see it. Well, that's a good photograph. But while we talk about this painting, your husband has made some incredible pieces of film of your work in sort of stop frame photography. So you see this in process, and we're going to be giving all the connections and sites that people can find you on. But just talk about the process of actually making this particular piece or pieces like it. What do you do? What is this on? Is this on a board? Is it on canvas? What are we looking at?
This is on a wooden panel, and the wooden panel doesn't have any texture like a canvas, which allows you to get a lot more detail. So there's not a lot of brush strokes visible. And I do other kinds of paintings that show more brush strokes that are on a more textured canvas. But this particular style of painting is very, very smooth. Essentially, the reason I started doing these is because I started studying figure drawing with contemporary artists who were teaching in the way that people taught figure drawing for 500 years up until about 1920. And I rediscovered some living artists who are still teaching in this way, and I studied with them. And so I was doing figure drawings that were 40, 60, 100-hour figure drawings in pencil. And when I took some time off and I only did drawing, when I came back to painting, I was like, okay, well, I really want to practice these ideas in paint. What is something that I can set up in my studio that won't move, that I can work from life, because I didn't want to work from photos, because I wasn't working from photos when I did the figure drawings. What can I set up from life and work for about 50 or 60 hours from life without it moving, but also still make it look dynamic and interesting? And so I started just experimenting with these arrangements. So this painting was probably about 60 hours, and with really small, tiny round brushes, similar to the pencils I was using for figure drawing. And I just sort of, as an experiment for myself, wanted to see if I wasn't rushing to get it done, if I wasn't trying to do a single session painting or a 3-day painting or a 4-day painting, if I just took whatever amount of time that I wanted to take this image to the highest level I could, what can I achieve? And so I started this series. I didn't know it was going to be a series. It was just going to be an exercise, but I started this series and I just really loved it. And I was actually surprised by myself. I was surprised that I did it. So I was working under a stable light source. This is north light coming down from a skylight. And so you have this really dramatic, almost biblical feeling of the light coming down. So I was sort of thinking of it as sort of somebody kind of striding towards you in the wind with a cloak on, and having this sense of majesty and this sense of grandeur in just a really small, goblet and household item of this wax paper that I really like, because it's not plastic, so you don't get that plasticky look, but you can sculpt it and arrange it and it will stay. And in the background, in the actual setup, I'll have all sorts of little strings and wires kind of holding it all in the position that I want it to hold it, because it'll slowly sag over the course of a month. So I'll spend about a month on it.
What I find extraordinary about the work, there's so much to say about it as someone who's done some painting and knows a little about art. But beyond that, there's this extraordinary presence to your stuff that is so much, I don't know how to put this correctly, but it is so much beyond what can be done with a photograph. There are so many choices in this that reflect you and what you do with paint. So, that's why I hesitate to call it realistic. because this is not realism. This is painting. It's not an attempt to recreate photography. And
and even our understanding of photography, you know that you can take a bad picture of yourself and a good picture of yourself. You can even be looking great in the mirror and try a selfie, and the selfie doesn't turn out. So we have this sort of cultural idea that the photograph is truth. And that painting is an interpretation. When the photograph is actually an interpretation, it's just usually the machine's interpretation, unless it's really a photograph in the hands of an artist. It's usually a machine's interpretation of what you're seeing. It's choosing which values and colors to emphasize and which values and colors to de-emphasize, which is why photographs from the 1970s all look green and yellow to us, because that was the aesthetic of the time. So photographs aren't necessarily any more real than a painting. It's just that the decisions are more mechanical.
Yeah, and I find, in looking at this and just finding it so moving, knowing, what it represents, but also just the kind of argument it makes for the intrinsic worth of beauty without it being sentimental. There's nothing sentimental or pretty about this painting. There's
certainly people who would accuse it of being sentimental and pretty in terms of the wider art world. And essentially that really held me back for about a decade. I graduated from art school with the idea that I was supposed to do something important and unique. And I had a portfolio full of figure drawings and figure paintings done from life, from the model, and just had no idea what to do. And so I would sort of throw myself at a canvas and just hope something happened, and quickly became very discouraged. I just didn't understand what it meant to be an artist. I went to 4 years of full-time art school, and I graduated sort of, somebody's supposed to pay me for something, So I expected to be poor, that's fine. But I just didn't really know what it meant to be an artist. Now, very close to me, Risdy's in Rhode Island, very close to me down in New York City, there are artists working in a figurative tradition and showing in major galleries like Forum Gallery in the 80s and the 90s. So there were pockets of people doing this. It's just that before the internet, if you didn't find each other, you just didn't find each other. In fact, somebody who's a very famous teacher there now, who teaches classical realism, teaches the kind of painting and drawing that I do. He's only about 5 or 6 years older than me. His name is Jacob Collins. He lives in New York City. In the 90s, the way you got in touch with him is you heard about him by word of mouth. You went to his studio in Brooklyn and you put a note under his door with your phone number on the piece of paper. So that was the way. This is one of the reasons that none of us could find each other. And now with the explosion of the internet of the last 20 years, suddenly all these people who really want to learn to paint and draw realistically, who love art, who love the history of art, who love the history of painting, are finding each other. I'm sure the same way that people who study a certain kind of beetle all find each other too. Every single interest, you can find other people who are doing it. And it's made for this enormous resurgence in the last 20 years. There are more figurative, representational artists working in a historical tradition today than there's thousands more today than there were even 20 years ago.
Now you actually sort of became countercultural in a sense, because you were there during the time when what you do or became as a painter was really out of fashion. Do you find the art community now at the highest level less monolithic and sort of totalitarian, if I may say? When you think of places like the Basel Art Fair or the Venice Biennale and these kind of places, has it opened up?
Sort of two art worlds. My art world is very, very small branch and really unknown and discredited by the larger art world. There are some crossovers. Stephen Assail and Max Ginsberg are artists who are 10 and 20 years older than me, and they were making figurative art in the 80s and 90s. And they have, like Andrew Wyeth, they have managed to gain a foothold in some major collections, but there's still a huge divide between this tiny little realist art world that I paint in, and the galleries that show realist art are really completely different than the galleries that show sort of the larger contemporary art world. So yeah, you're not going to see a lot of realism in the Venice Biennial. But there are galleries in New York showing beautiful representational and realistic and historic traditional work that are there and are showing and selling to a greater degree than ever before. But it's still very much put to the side, and And, people I went to art school with, in the early 90s, people I'm still friends with, my friends who are painters from the 90s, they appreciate what I'm doing. Like, they love what I'm doing, but there's still a great divide between the galleries they're showing at and the galleries that I'm showing at. It's just a completely different world.
What do you think the impulse was coming out of the 1950s to bring us to a point where the actual art of painting, I'm not talking about art as in artistic, but the art and the craft of painting, became so discounted to the point where it almost seemed as if it was a threat to the contemporary art scene? Was it a sort of a philosophical decision in terms of what the meaning of art is, or was it a technical series of events that, where do you go after abstract expressionism? Was it that the university community, did the university community take over art and suddenly teach it as a subject? And did that change everything, since universities had never been involved in art before? It had always been on another plane. I mean, the university involvement of art is fairly recent. I just don't know. How do you must have done something.
It's true. Yeah, I've done a lot of thinking about this. There's a whole bunch of cultural things with the, in terms of the invention of the handheld consumer camera is a really big influence on visual art. But there is a way that I believe music, and even classical music, has survived the Industrial Revolution the way that visual art, representational visual art with a historical tradition, has not survived the Industrial Revolution.
I think that's really an interesting point. How would you define what the difference is?
Every single person can name lots of musicians that they love, that they collect, that they follow, that they listen to every single day. Music is part of our everyday life. Visual art used to be part of people's everyday life in that way, and it's just not. It's sort of considered this sort of expensive thing. People will spend $2,000 on a couch, but they would never spend $2,000 on a piece of artwork. And so it's just not part of our cultural understanding of how you define yourself as a human being. When you meet someone at a party, you talk about the musicians you like. You're not going to, unless you're with other painters, you're not going to talk about the painters that you like. And so there's some way, and I have been trying to figure that out for a long time, why painting has not made that leap. Part of it is that something about the ability to reproduce music actually made it more accessible, whereas prints on your wall are sort of considered something teenagers do, and some of us do in some ways, but it's not that everybody has a print collection that they value and they show off to their friends. And frankly, in the 19th century, when you went to someone's home, you could look through their collection of engraved prints, copies of master paintings, and you would sit and admire that the way we would sit and listen to music today. And so there's just something, and there's a lot of different things at stake. Photography has a huge thing to do with it. We don't really culturally, our brains have just not evolved to really understand what a photograph is doing. How did it capture this image? When you show certain societies that aren't exposed to photographs, when you show them a photograph, they feel like their soul has been stolen. And I think actually their soul has been stolen. I don't think that's such a crazy idea. And I think that there's a way that it's a real psychological and evolutionary jolt to our system to see imagery. And there's something that we've sort of lost, and we're still trying to figure out as a culture, what do images mean for us? And then depicting human beings is very fraught and very difficult. When I sat down as a painter and I felt like I wanted to start creating original works that included figures, do you choose the same, 25-year-old white women that have been depicted as sexually available in paintings before the Industrial Revolution? I don't want to paint like a 19th century male when I look at women. And so I sort of launched an investigation with a few of my friends of how are contemporary women painting women. And, and so you bring up issues of gender, you bring up issues of race, both painting worlds, the larger contemporary painting world, and especially even more so, my small realist painting world are extremely white and extremely male, to even greater degree than the larger contemporary world, which is also extremely white and extremely male. So painting people is very fraught, which is one of the reasons that in the 60s and the 70s and the Cultural Revolution, it became, we had feminists making teacups and lining them with fur before we had them. They're not going to paint women as they're doing a cultural critique of the entire history of painting women. And so there's a lot of, it's one of the reasons that I'm still a still life painter, in that I want to be able to look and feel and do something. And I'm still thinking really hard about how do we depict human beings in our era that is using the tools of the 500 years of art history, but is not looking at women and looking at people the way that those people were looked at.
I saw a very interesting program a while back with Mary Beard, the Roman historian from the UK, who's one of my favorite commentators on so many things. And she did a very interesting, I think I saw it on Netflix, on the nude, the history of the nude in art. And it's a little off her beaten path. And she actually sat down, took off her clothes, sat with a good artist who was able to draw her, showed herself as a model, as an older woman with an aging body. And it was one of the more intelligent discussions I've ever seen, is Mary Beard's on the nude. You know, lots of people have lots of things to say in terms of what you've just been talking about, but she somehow was able to leapfrog the contemporary discussion as if none of it had happened, and really look at it. Like, what were the Romans doing? What were the Greeks doing? What does this mean in our culture? And then, of course, got into the male gaze and the whole thing. But I didn't find her talk either politicized or with some agenda that you could see a mile off coming. She was really looking at it as art first, which is unusual these days, because so much discussion about art, it really just descends immediately into politics and social critique. So there's feminist art, and there's this kind of art, and there's that kind of art, which I sort of object to, because it almost strips the artist of agency. And right, it's never about the art. It's about, you know, the social commentary that may or may not have been intended.
The thing is that as a woman painter, frankly, I would not have had the training that I have been able to glean, which is meager training compared to 19th century training, but I would not have been trained at all in the 19th century. By the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which was the preeminent art school of the entire world, only accepted women very begrudgingly in 1898. 1898. I mean, that's like my grandmother's grandmother. That's not that long, you know, like, right. So and then essentially the very minute that women started seriously studying classical figure painting from the nude, that was the very minute that the entire art world turned away from representing human beings in art. And I think that there might be something connected there. That essentially, we let the women in, now we're going to go do something else because that's not important anymore. And the idea of the way that women, the way that people are painting and drawing very realistically was very actively turned against throughout the 20th century. So there's a lot of reasons there. In terms of academia, it hasn't happened in music. You can go to Juilliard and you can learn to become a very highly skilled, world-class, world-renowned classical musician. You will be required to study modern music theory. You will be required to try to do contemporary things. It will be a struggle. I'm not saying they have it easy, but there is a place for them in society. You know, there is place. My nephew just got accepted into Manhattan School of Music for the French horn. And so you can go and study the French horn and be a French horn classical musician in a way that you can't as a painter. It's very, very different.
You know, it seems to me that the world of music, because it depends on performance, which in the end, endowments and all the rest aside, depends on somebody buying a ticket, has not been able to be the creature of an academic culture of modernity in the way that painting became, that somehow between the commercialization of the high-end art market in terms of the big bucks, combined with an academic view of art as something other than what had always been classically defined as art, there's an elitism that in the world of music simply doesn't fly, because whether it's the Boston Symphony Orchestra or whomever it might be, they still have to sell their season ticket to someone. And yes, someone might want to go to a Stockhausen concert or Schoenberg or John Cage or this or that. But in the end, Mozart and Brahms and so forth and so on still get played, because there's a democracy of choice in who buys tickets. People vote with their feet and their ears. The contemporary art scene does not have that, because you have a group of people who can buy things and put them in a in a warehouse in Geneva and keep them as an investment, and or simply underwrite some sort of event at MoMA or whatever it might be, irrespective of what people actually want to see and where they will go. And when I say people, I not just mean, quote, the so-called ordinary person. I mean large numbers of concert goers and so forth. So I think that somehow art has become more of a victim of a mentality of a small group of people who look at, now my dad, Francis Schaeffer, who's the theologian, would have all looked at this as part of the philosophical argument of the decline of Western culture as it moved away from its Christian base. I don't buy that, but I do buy that a new religion of modernity came about after the era of the Impressionists, in which art suddenly had to become something, quote, important in a way that it hadn't been seen before. There wasn't, the aesthetic side was minimized, and the side of a sort of an ongoing nonstop revolution was exalted. That's simplification, but I don't know. How do you feel about some of that?
Well, it is interesting because art is actually very political in that representational art does have more politically conservative collectors and politically conservative artists.
Yes.
And from their point of view, the New York and London art scene of the 50s through today is sort of liberalism run amok, right? Sort of just banishing all tradition, banishing all traditional values, and just making everything about shock and awe. There is that sort of basic simplification. What I'm curious about is, as a liberal, as a feminist, can I be a representational painter and not be assumed to be having conservative values about art? So I struggle with that in myself. What does it mean that I come from a background, Waring was very classical education oriented, and that's really what planted the seed in me. But it wasn't political conservatism necessarily that at that school. That it was coming from actually a very European liberal idea that all people should be educated. And so trying to reconcile all those things is something that I constantly struggle with. There's definitely a conservative part of me that is frustrated by sort of this rejection of
method.
Working hard to learn a skill, right?
Yeah, well, it's just a rejection of method. It's like trying to make
rejection of method. Yeah, having everything be shocking, having everything be making a point. There is a part of me that rejects that, in that there is a deep part of our soul, and I think it's apolitical. I think it has nothing to do with politics, but there's a deep part of every single person's soul that when we rest in contemplation and look at something that is striking us as beautiful, as however we define that we get a sense of being in touch with something greater than ourselves in a way that we don't get through other methods. And so there's a sort of essential human ache for that contemplative experience, and whether you find it through art. And so finding that place where your brain turns off and your politics turns off and your sense of self turns off, and you just feel like you're having an experience of feeling appreciation for the world, feeling appreciation for the moment that you're living in, that is the artistic experience. So I think it really transcends politics, but there's a way that politics has co-opted, these sort of ways of expression. And I do think that a lot of contemporary art isn't necessarily about that experience of being moved in the presence of. Now, plenty of people describe that experience when looking at a Rothko, feeling like they're in church, secular people feeling like they're in church, feeling like they're having a spiritual experience when they look at a Rothko and certain other painters and certain other artists. You don't hear people talking about that quite so much anymore, but it can happen. It can certainly happen with all different kinds of art. For me, that's what art is important to me about. I want to sit, I want to have that experience. I want to have that experience that is outside of regular life, that is an experience of deeply knowing myself and deeply feeling my connection to the universe for a moment, and being able to have that moment end up in the painting by whatever means necessary so that other people can have that moment. To me, that's what's interesting about art. There's
and
lots
to
of
me, it's not just the finished work that says that. It is the discipline of skill you have brought to it. I've had some serious medical procedures in my life, And sometimes I'm so moved by the level of skill that is brought to my bedside when I had an anterior discectomy. And Dr. Griffith Harsh, who's now at Stanford, goes through here to fix my spine there. 4.5 hours later, I come out alive. And the fact that he's taken 15 or 20 years of his life to be able to do this without killing me is in itself a moving experience to me. So
Absolutely.
when I look at your paintings, and if we could just have the self-portrait pop up in a minute while we're talking about this. When I look at this self-portrait that will appear magically, we have, we're looking at you now, a painting that you made of yourself in your studio with some of the objects behind you that you painted. Okay, one of the things I find so moving about that is that I'm looking at someone who has invested in me to give me a contemplative moment by taking a huge chunk of her life to become, my contemplative neurosurgeon. She did not do this in 5 minutes. And so she's voted for my significance by investing her work with this level of mastery. And I just find that in itself a moving experience. And one other thing I want to note, when people talk about figurative art being politicized, of course it was. The Medici did not pay their artists and support them to draw critical posters glorifying the Pazzis and the other families in Florence that were their rivals. But that said, when you look at the statements of the pictures that come through from people like Botticelli, in which he was exploring the Renaissance themes of humanism, they're very rebellious against the status quo of the smothering dictatorship of the church at the time. It's not a coincidence that Galileo and these other people were working in the same climate, supported by the same family. I see your work.
Pagan themes.
That's right, painting pagan themes. So the idea that somehow figurative art has always been conservative or on the side of the establishment is really not the case. There would have been no Renaissance if that had been so.
No, that's a very post-1950s idea. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And I look at your work very similarly, because we live in a fast-cut society that cheapens human experience. You're providing us with moments of contemplation based in a skill set that in itself tells me my life is worth something, because here's someone who's gotten this good at something. I see a real symmetry there, and I just want you to think about that, talk about it a little bit.
I appreciate that. One of my primary teachers, Julia Aristides, who is really one of the leading founders of teaching people in these methods, told me when she first taught me, the very first class I took with her back in 2007, she did a little lecture about the history of art education that to me was revelatory. And she said that up through the 19th century, doctors were educated for 10 years and artists were educated for 12. Yeah. And so you were considered to be a student from about 16 to 28. You were literally just copying the master that you were working under, yeah, or studying in a school and doing whatever the teacher told you. You were not considered ready to do your own work until you were at least mid to late 20s. And so the idea that you're going to, go to undergraduate school for a few years and even get a master's degree for a couple of more years after that, and then somehow make original work that nobody's ever seen before, is a really modern concept. A really modern meaning it's only about 75 or 100 years old. Yeah. Whereas for 500 years before that, nobody expected that. And so something very significant, something was very similar about art training from 1500 through 1900, and something has been very different since then.
What I find strange about that mentality is that when you look at some very contemporary forms of expression, let's take industrial light and magic, sitting right there in California, the level of expertise that is brought by the old hands there to do some Star Wars remake, they gained over a 30-year arc of experience of inventing a whole new medium in which their entire quest is to use science and electronics and art and drawing and so forth, all put in this new form to meld it with actual sets and actual actors to give you an absolutely comfortable experience rooted in their own technique. And yet somehow, the very field of art now, in terms of a lack of training and expertise in some ways, denies that. So I find it incredibly ironic. And,
well, I will say about that. My husband worked in that industry,
yeah,
and many of our very good friends are actually the top animators for Star Wars. So, I know a lot about this field, and actually they are worked extremely hard without unions. And
yes,
they are actually very much taken advantage of for their artistry, in my opinion. They are burnt out by age 40. They are paid minimally, no matter how much the movie makes. The individuals that are doing all that industrial light and magic in the back end are not necessarily well compensated. And so we are making this huge cultural investment in these incredible feats of very, very high skill levels. And yet the artists are still not as compensated, say, like the actors. So
yeah, exactly.
So that there's still sort of a divide, and there's still young artists pouring out of art schools who want to work on Pixar films and who want to work on Star Wars films and who are filled with these dreams of doing that. And by 38, they are chewed up, spit out, beaten out. I mean, there's no protection for them in the industry. So there's still a way that our culture is taking advantage of artists and not compensating them.
Well, and it runs across a lot of the mentality of, the tech corporations and so forth, who are doing very much the same thing to some of their people. There may be scooters and skateboards in the hall and you eat sushi for lunch, but at the end of the day, God help you if you want to put your relationships or a family or something ahead of work and not be available 24/7 to just give everything to this.
Well, a common theme we're talking about here is post-industrial revolution capitalism, right?
Yeah.
And that has many implications for lifestyle and spirituality and family values and all sorts of things. But what we're talking about is the commodification of human labor.
Yeah.
And so that's pretty, I could talk all day about that.
But isn't that interesting that at the same time as you're in RISD trying to learn how to draw and paint better, in a more classical kind of discipline, and the talk of art is all very, idealistic in some ways, what art can be. It's very collaborative and all the rest of it, that when it comes to the actual individual use of the skill sets people develop, whether they're animators or anything else, you might as well be in the 19th century in a sweatshop.
Yeah, it's definitely a factory production when it comes to video games and movies. That's certainly true. And
I mean,
painters are just trained to teach other painters. So you get your masters to go teach other people to get their masters. So
yeah,
but that's the same as studying French literature or poetry. I mean, there's certain.
Well, and you see a decline in the humanities
fields
as well, across the board, less interest in the humanities, more in business school and this kind of a thing. When you look at the place of your own work in the context of our moment in time, perhaps I'm optimistic, but I think that that in the same way that, one still listens to Mozart post Stockhausen and John Cage and all the rest of it, and contemporary popular music is certainly not atonal or 12-tone row, or no one would be buying it. I can't help but think that at some point, the work that you're personally doing, Sadie Valeri is doing, and people who are your contemporaries who have certain ideas that are similar to yours, is not going to stand the test of time better than, say, Damien Hirst's Shark in a Tank, which has had to be changed 3 times because it rots and so forth. It's an interesting statement, but I cannot see longevity for the collaborative kind of politicized or rather trendy work that comes post 1970.
It's very hard to tell what is going to stand the test of time. It'll stand the test of time in terms of anybody studying art in the 90s will have to talk about Damien Hirst. So it'll stand the test of time for people who are putting their attention on that. In terms of standing the test of time, in terms of speaking to future generations, I think all you can do is do the best you can do to do what resonates with you now. And as an artist, do what resonates with me now and hope that somebody in the future will feel that kind of resonance as well. Speaking in terms of Mozart, in the time of Mozart, we don't have these spikes of genius of people making work that survives the ages in isolation. This American concept of genius or talent makes us think that Mozart was the main guy. Mozart was one, he would have graduated the same year from music school. I realized he studied with his father on his own, but in that milieu, in that environment,
Sure.
there would be thousands and thousands and thousands trained to extremely high ability. It takes thousands and thousands of artists being trained to extremely high ability to have several people really, really rise above and sort of set the standard, set this and really say something for that entire generation. The fact that art school is $100,000 at least, and you come out of it not being able to paint an apple sitting on a shelf tells me that it's going to be pretty hard for any painter living today to really make work that survives the ages. I'm working in a group of thousands of artists who are working as traditional representational painters. We are out here, we are doing it, but the numbers are tiny. Meanwhile, the demand from people like to see representational art. People who are not trained in the arts like to see representational art. The Met got a hold of the Vermeer's Milkmaid, which is a painting about this big, showing a woman standing by a window, pouring a pitcher of milk into a little bowl, very peaceful, light coming from a single mullioned window, very small, tiny, peaceful scene. 500,000 people lined up around the block for months to see this painting in person. And the Met was even surprised by the appeal of that. And so there's something that is really people want. Yeah. And, meanwhile, the Met is struggling for funding, so there's... Well,
speaking of which, the self-portrait we were looking at is lit in a very similar way to the woman with the picture.
Well, there's a reason for that, is that when you work by natural light and you're a right-handed artist, you have to have, it's switched, it's backwards here in the way we're talking, but when you work in natural light, you'll see Rembrandt does the same thing. You can tell which artists are right-handed and which are left-handed. He switched his light source a lot too, but you'll see it often coming from one side. When you're working from one side, you need the light source to hit your canvas from one side. When you're working in a room, it's also going to hit your subject from that one side. So there is a very intentionally Vermeer-esque setup of my self-portrait, but it's also just literally due to the mechanics of the way light falls if you're going to work under natural light.
Yeah, I have a question for you, and that is, now we're seeing a closer view of the picture, talking about Vermeer and you. I'm wondering when people who are listening to this, and especially on a podcast where there's less written information up on a screen, take a moment to take us through how you started your art school, what people can do in terms of training with you who are interested in getting in touch with you, just and go through it slowly so that we can really get the word out on anybody who's interested in training with Sadie Valeri, your school, and the people you work with.
Yeah, sure. So I ran an art school in person for 10 years here in San Francisco. We actually lost our space well before COVID in 2019. And so it's all 100% online, but I had actually been teaching online for many years. I feel a responsibility, since this information was so difficult for me to attain. I feel a responsibility to make it as available as possible. And so for extremely affordable rates, you can essentially learn many, many years of full-time art school, get access to that for a really low monthly subscription. And so that's, my website is sadieartschool.com, just to keep it really simple.
Just spell it all out, Sadie.
Sadie, SADIEARTSCHOOL, sadieartschool.com. It's the website for my atelier. So atelier just is French for art school or art workshop. So Sadie Valeri Atelier is the name of my art school. And essentially you can start with no art experience. First thing we do is teach you how to sharpen a pencil and how to draw a line. And from there you build your skills. And this is a really traditional way. Art used to be taught like math. You learn 2 + 2, and then you learn addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and on to calculus and algebra and geometry and all of that. The way that we teach math today is you cannot be expected to understand division before you understand 2 + 2. since art is not taught that way in general, we have this idea that you're talented, so therefore you should just be able to do calculus on day one. And if you're bad at doing calculus, it means you're not talented. It's just a bizarre way to think about learning anything. So I teach art the way I would teach a sport or the way I would teach mathematics. In fact, speaking of doctors, I've taught a lot of doctors, people who are very technical, people who are musicians or have reached a high level in sports or gymnastics or some sort of physical skill really resonate with this kind of training, because it really is the kind of training that you undergo to gain mastery in any subject. It's just that for some reason, we haven't applied that to art for 75 years. We've kind of thought, oh, just get in there and like make a million things badly and eventually you'll make something well, when we don't teach anything else like that. So this is step-by-step, methodical. You can't move on until you master a certain step. So everybody starts by drawing a sphere of just a ball lit by a single light source. Eventually you might be able to paint an egg lit from a single light source. You can't paint a human portrait if you can't paint an egg.
Go back and give us the Sadie Valeri atelier all slowly again for people who are listening.
Yes, it's sadieartschool.com, sadieartschool.com. And if you are 18 or under, I want to make sure that this is not financially too difficult for you to attain. So if you're 18 or under and you are interested in learning this kind of thing, just send me an email and I'm happy to give you access for free.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, anyone who's even vaguely interested should take advantage of this and jump into it. It's kind of a unique offer. Ernie, if you can, I don't know if you can put Silver Goblet up again a little more in close up like you did with the portrait, so we can see it a little closer than just the whole picture. If you can make it pop up like that, great, but otherwise just put it back up again. Yeah, so that is a little bit of an enlargement in the middle of the picture. In your journey as an artist who has in a way become countercultural, and at the same time you're a feminist and your views are liberal politically, you're working in this traditional medium, have you had the chance to express some of the uniqueness of the way you approach this in wider venues? I know you've been interviewed here and there, and we're talking today. Have you found a general interest? I mean, I know in your students who line up by the hundreds to train with you, but in the wider culture, have there been people who have paid attention to what you were doing at this point?
I really feel there's this really deep desire. Anytime I talk to anybody, friends or family, my friends or family will introduce me to someone and say, oh, this is my friend Sadie, you should see her paintings. People who don't know anything about art are surprised to see somebody working representationally and working traditionally. And they're a little nervous. If you say you're a painter, you say you're an artist, they're nervous to look at your work because they're afraid that they're not going to understand it. And they're so relieved when they're like, oh, you just paint still life and you paint people and you paint things that I understand. So there's this deep desire, this deep, intense craving that I think humanity has for seeing realistic representational work. And they're just not exposed to it. It's very hard to know how to see it. We also have this idea in America that fine art is sort of for the elite or snobby, like you only go to a museum and look at art if you're a certain kind of person. And I think in going to the Metropolitan Museum of Art or going to a historical art museum might be people's only opportunity to see representational and realistic painting and drawing that looks like the world that they live in. And yet we sort of have these cultural barriers against that make people feel like they don't belong there. And I think there's just a real craving.
Yeah, when people want to see more of your work, Ernie, you can go back to us talking now away from the picture. When people want to see more of your work, as well as maybe take some classes with you, do they go to the same site? Where can we see the most of your work?
Yeah, you can go to sadieartschool.com. Under the About section, you'll see a portfolio of my images. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook, and I post lots of artwork on there as well.
And where can we find those wonderful films that your husband has made of you working?
Those are all when you subscribe to the sadieartschool.com website. When you subscribe to it, you can see all of my painting and drawing instruction, which is how to paint and draw many, many subjects. So you can have months and months or years and years of coursework there for you to go through step by step.
Yeah. And I think, just kind of to wrap things up here a little bit, let's talk a little bit about the political moment we're in. We've gone through COVID, we've gone through the Trump years, we're coming out the other side. It just seems to me in this context, more than ever, your kind of contemplative object that you make is more of essence than ever. I mean, it's exactly what I'm trying to recapture in my own life in many ways on a daily basis, with the garden that I'm in, taking care of my grandchildren, things that do not change and are not fast paced and make us a little more human and contemplative. Let's just wrap that up a little bit, talking about the place that you see, if I dare use the word spirituality, that your work fills for you personally as you make it, as you look at it, as you connect with other people through it. Because to me, your work has an incredible spiritual dynamic to it.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. I think that there is a real, again, a real craving for that kind of experience. And in my own life, I was raised in a church that my parents actually started. And that church, my family and I left that church when my dad came out as gay when I was 18. And so by the end of my 20s, I was no longer a Christian and no longer part of a Christian community. And I have not considered myself a Christian since then. Even though I believe a lot of the tenets of Christianity, I have not, the community is just not a place that I can be. And so there's a real craving. There's something very essential, though, about prayer, about a secular version of prayer, which is meditation. And so I've really gotten into meditation, especially during this last era of COVID, especially leading up to my 50th birthday. And I find that the process of meditation is what I've already been doing as a painter in terms of screening everything out, getting deeply in touch with who I am as a person at my most essential nature. If you go deep inside yourself and tap into your most essential nature, you suddenly realize that you are deeply connected to every other living being. And that connection is love. And so it's through that sense of love for my subject, love for my own experience as a human being, and that feeling of connection I get with anybody who looks at my art or anybody who just wants to have that kind of experience. To me, that is the way that I've been able to have a spiritual experience as a secular person. And I think that as a secular person who's very mistrustful of organizations, mistrustful of communities because they've been so damaging to me personally and to other people, we still have a very deep need to feel, to have a spiritual life and to develop spiritually. My spirituality is very different than it was 10 years ago. My spirituality is very different than it was 2 years ago. And to continually be asking ourselves those questions of, what are we doing here? Why are we here? How is it that the universe ended up making two people who can sit at a computer and talk to each other from across the country and talk about things that we love and talk about our shared history together and feel that connection with each other? I have a lifelong affection for your wonderful daughter, Jessica. That is my tie to you, and I will always feel that tie to you. There is something that binds us together that is unnameable, and I think that art can help us experience that. And now more than ever in this political moment, this post-Trump era, and especially after this year of contemplation that we've all been through with COVID, of just having our lives turned upside down, makes you question everything. And I think finding those moments of contemplation is what we are all realizing is just necessary for the human experience.
Well, we're going to put links to everything everywhere on all our sites, so people will be able to find you. Somebody wrote in and said, I come from a family of artists, but no training. I think my biggest issue has to do with patience and resting with contemplation, like you said. Did you start with oils?
Yeah, I was lucky to get introduced to oils when I was 18 or 19 in art school. In terms of the patience question, I think anybody would say that they're not patient, but if you find yourself with a child that you love, you will find that you can talk to them about a rock for quite a long time. So
Mhm.
there's a way that when you slow down and you're experiencing a moment of something, you're not saying, I need to be more patient. You're just feeling a connection and that automatically slows you down.
Yeah.
So I don't consider myself a patient person. My husband will wash the pots and pans after I wash the pots and pans because he says I don't do a good job because I rush through everything. I
Mm.
rush and I'm messy all the time in my general life. I'm not a naturally patient person. But patience is something that happens when we are contemplating, when we are deep inside ourselves and feeling connection to ourselves and to other people. And that is just something that happens. You can't aim for patience by trying to be patient. Nothing will make you feel like an impatient person than trying to be patient.
Yeah, I find the same thing in writing. And that is, one of the reasons I know I've been called to be a writer and keep writing books is because it's one of the few areas in my life where I experience being drawn into the subject matter. And it isn't because I'm suddenly patient, because I'm a fast, messy person too, in lots of ways, very much like you. But in that area, I don't find that I'm having to make myself be patient because, in the analogy with children is a good one. Listen, I can't thank you enough, not just for this interview, but just for who you are as a person. You're one of those people that someone like me who tries to be creative looks at not just with great admiration, but with a real sense of hope. I mean, to me, the world is a better place because you're in it, Sadie. And those of us who know you really, really love you.
Thank you so much.
So I think that's a good place to end. You are a very loved person by everyone who knows you. And your work speaks of an inner beauty that, is going to outlast both of us. But I just love your work. I think you're just tremendous. You're a prophet. So I love you, Sadie. Thank you for your painting. Thank you for what you do and who you are. So we will leave it there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.